Queen Victoria is famous for an empire, for the Victorian era, for 63 years on the British throne, for being the grandmother of Europe, for refinement and morality and progress. That's the official version. The textbook version. The statue in every former British colony version. But Victoria's actual life was far stranger and darker than the sanitized. History suggests she was crowned at 18 after her uncle died and became the most powerful woman in the world, despite spending her childhood essentially imprisoned by her own mother. She married her first cousin, had 9 children, and then spent 40 years in pathological mourning after her husband died, wearing black every day and keeping his room exactly as he left it. She built the largest empire in human history, while being deeply racist toward the people that empire controlled. She was called the grandmother of Europe because her children married into every royal house. But those marriages spread hemophilia across European royalty like a genetic time bomb, and her empire's policies killed tens of millions through famine, war, and deliberate neglect. If you're interested in the dark reality behind historical figures we're taught to admire, subscribe to A Disturbed Historian. We are exploring the people who shaped history, not the myths built around them. Victoria wasn't supposed to be queen. She was 5th in line when she was born, but her father died when she was 8 months old. Then her 3 uncles ahead of her in succession died without legitimate heirs. Suddenly, this little girl was heir to the British throne, and her mother, the Duchess of Kent, saw an opportunity, not for Victoria, for herself. The Duchess, along with her advisor John Conroy, created what became known as the Kensington system. They isolated Victoria completely. She wasn't allowed friends her own age. She slept in her mother's room every night until she became queen. She couldn't walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. She was never alone. Every conversation was monitored. Every letter was read. They controlled everything she saw, everyone she met, every piece of information she received. The goal was to make Victoria completely dependent, so that when she became queen, her mother and Conroy would be the real power behind the throne. They'd control the monarchy through a girl. They deliberately kept weak and isolated. Victoria understood what was happening. Even as a child, she recognized the manipulation, and she hated them for it. There are diary entries where she describes feeling like a prisoner, where she talks about longing for freedom, where she counts down to her 18th birthday, when she could legally take the throne without a regency. The moment she became queen, literally hours after her coronation, Victoria banished her mother from her private quarters, expelled Conroy from court. She'd been psychologically tortured for years by these people, and her first act as monarch was revenge. Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This wasn't unusual for royalty. Keeping bloodlines pure, maintaining alliances, all of that required marrying relatives. But Victoria and Albert were closely related, and that had consequences. Victoria carried the gene for hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder. She passed it to several of her children, who then spread it through European royal families via marriage. Hemophilia became known as the royal disease. Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, had it. Spain's royal family had it. It shaped European history because sickly heirs and the desperate attempts to cure them influenced political decisions and succession crises. But Victoria didn't know she was a carrier. Genetics wasn't understood yet. She just knew some of her children and grandchildren suffered from a mysterious condition where minor injuries caused uncontrollable bleeding. And there was nothing anyone could do. No treatment, no cure. Just watch children and grandchildren suffer and sometimes die from something inherited through her bloodline. That guilt haunted her, though she rarely discussed it publicly. Victoria was very good at maintaining appearances, at presenting the image of a strong, stable monarch even when her personal life was chaotic and traumatic. Her relationship with Albert was complicated. She loved him obsessively, wrote constantly about her passion for him. But she also resented him. Albert tried to control her, wanted to manage her political decisions, pushed her toward policies she didn't always agree with. They fought, frequently, loudly. Court observers described screaming matches, Victoria throwing things, Albert retreating to separate rooms. This wasn't the refined royal romance popular culture depicts. This was a dysfunctional relationship between two strong-willed people trapped in roles they didn't entirely choose. Albert died in 1861 at age 42. The official cause was typhoid fever, though some historians suspect stomach cancer or Crohn's disease. Victoria was devastated, not just sad, completely psychologically broken. She entered mourning and never left it. For the remaining 40 years of her life, she wore black every day. She kept Albert's room exactly as it was when he died. Fresh clothes laid out daily, hot water brought for shaving, as if he might return. She refused to appear in public for years, neglected her duties as monarch. Britain effectively had an absent queen for over a decade, while Victoria isolated herself in grief. Her obsession with Albert's death bordered on necrophilia. She slept with his nightshirt, kept plaster casts of his hands, commissioned hundreds of portraits and sculptures, built monuments, named buildings after him. She wrote to her children constantly about how much she missed him, how unbearable life was without him, how she longed to die and join him. Her children found this suffocating. They'd lost their father, but they also lost their mother to grief that consumed her entirely. Victoria's mourning became a national problem. The monarchy's popularity declined. People questioned why they were funding a queen who refused to perform her role. There were genuine Republican movements arguing Britain should abolish the monarchy entirely. Victoria's Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, had to carefully coax her back into public life. He flattered her relentlessly, called her the fairy queen, wrote her letters praising her wisdom, slowly convinced her that Britain needed her, that Albert would want her to serve. It worked partly. Victoria resumed some duties, but she never stopped mourning, never stopped wearing black, never stopped treating Albert's death as the central tragedy of her existence. While Victoria mourned, the British Empire expanded aggressively. By the end of her reign, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and population. This is presented as achievement, as proof of British superiority and Victoria's successful reign. The reality is darker. The empire was built and maintained through violence, exploitation, and systematic racism, and Victoria supported it completely. The Irish famine killed over 1 million people during Victoria's reign. Britain controlled Ireland, controlled its food exports. While Irish peasants starved, Ireland continued shipping food to Britain. The famine wasn't a natural disaster. It was policy. The British government refused significant aid, argued that helping would create dependency, blamed the Irish for their own suffering, called them lazy, inferior, said the famine was God's judgment on a backward people. Victoria donated a small amount to relief funds, far less than she spent on personal luxuries, and considered herself charitable for doing so. India faced multiple famines under British rule. The worst in the late 1870s, killed between 5 and 10 million people. British policies had destroyed traditional agriculture, forced farmers to grow cash crops for export instead of food. When drought hit, there was no food reserve. People starved while India exported grain to Britain. Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. In 1876, she loved the title, loved the exotic imagery, kept Indian servants, learned some Urdu, played at appreciation for Indian culture, while presiding over policies that devastated the subcontinent. Victoria was deeply racist. Her letters and diaries make this clear. She referred to non-white people using language that's unacceptable to even quote today. She believed firmly in racial hierarchy, that white Europeans, particularly British, were superior to everyone else. that colonized peoples needed British rule because they couldn't govern themselves. This wasn't unusual for her time. Most Europeans believed these things. But Victoria wasn't just any European. She was the monarch of the empire implementing these beliefs as policy. Her racism had body counts. The Boer War, fought at the end of Victoria's reign, introduced concentration camps to the world. The British rounded up Boer civilians, mostly women and children, and imprisoned them in camps with inadequate food, water, and medical care. 28,000 people died, mostly children. The camps were designed to break Boer resistance by making civilian populations suffer. Victoria supported the war. Knitted socks for soldiers, sent messages praising their bravery, never publicly acknowledged the camps or the deaths. Victoria's children and grandchildren married into every major European royal family. This created a vast network of related monarchs. She was called the grandmother of Europe. But this wasn't just family sentiment. These marriages were political strategy. Britain using royal bloodlines to create alliances and influence. Victoria's descendants sat on thrones in Russia, Germany, Spain, Romania, Greece, Norway, Sweden. When World War I broke out in 1914, 13 years after Victoria's death, many of the monarchs fighting each other were her grandchildren. Cousins killing cousins in a war that destroyed empires and killed millions. Victoria had 9 children and hated pregnancy. She was very open about this in private letters. Described pregnancy as making her feel like a cow or dog, resented the physical toll, resented being constantly pregnant through her 20s and 30s, resented that her duty as queen required producing heirs. She wasn't a warm mother. She found babies ugly, didn't particularly enjoy her children until they were older. Several of her children grew up feeling unloved. Her eldest son, Bertie, who became Edward VII, had a terrible relationship with her. She blamed him for Albert's death, convinced that stress from Bertie's scandalous behavior had weakened Albert's health. Victoria controlled her children's lives obsessively, chose their spouses, dictated their roles, punished disobedience with exile from court or cut off allowances. Her daughter Vicky, married to the future German Kaiser, wrote heartbreaking letters about feeling trapped between loyalty to her mother and her adopted country. Her son Leopold, who had hemophilia, was kept isolated and controlled, forbidden from normal activities, treated as fragile. He died at 30 from a minor fall that caused a brain hemorrhage. Victoria mourned but had spent his entire life limiting his freedom because of the disease she'd given him. Her relationship with her servants was strange. She had favorites. An Indian servant named Abdul Karim became particularly close to her in her later years. She called him her munshi, her teacher. He taught her Urdu. She gave him gifts, titles, status at court. The British establishment hated this. They thought it was inappropriate for the Empress to be so familiar with an Indian servant. Racist aristocrats tried to force him out. Victoria defended him fiercely. Some historians think the relationship was romantic or sexual. Others think Victoria just enjoyed having someone who treated her as a person rather than as queen. Either way, when Victoria died, her family immediately expelled Abdul Karim from court, destroyed letters, tried to erase evidence of the relationship. Victoria's reign is called the Victorian era. It's associated with progress, industrialization, scientific advancement, moral refinement. But the era was also characterized by brutal working conditions, child labor in factories and mines, massive inequality, workhouses where the poor were essentially imprisoned, moral hypocrisy where surface propriety hid widespread prostitution, abuse and exploitation. The Victorian era wasn't refined. It was grotesque. A thin veneer of respectability covering systemic cruelty. Victoria herself lived in massive luxury, while millions of her subjects lived in poverty. She owned multiple palaces, wore jewels worth fortunes, hosted elaborate banquets, traveled constantly despite claiming she was too grief-stricken to perform royal duties. The contrast between her wealth and the suffering of people in the empire she ruled was obscene. But she genuinely didn't see it as contradictory. She believed in hierarchy, that some people were meant to rule and live well while others served, that this was natural, ordained by God. Her final years were marked by increasing isolation and stubbornness. She refused to adapt to changing times, opposed reforms, resisted anything that challenged the order she'd known her entire life. She became a symbol of stagnation, even as the world around her changed rapidly. When she died in 1901, there was genuine mourning. She'd been queen for 63 years. Multiple generations had never known another monarch. But there was also relief, a sense that her death marked the end of an era that had lasted too long. Victoria's legacy is complicated. She gave her name to an era, presided over the height of British imperial power. Her children and grandchildren spread across European thrones. She's remembered as a strong female leader in an age when that was rare. But examining her actual life reveals someone far more flawed than the legend suggests. She was traumatized by her childhood, psychologically damaged by isolation and manipulation. She married her cousin and spread genetic disease through European royalty. She spent 40 years in mourning that bordered on mental illness. She was deeply racist, supported policies that killed millions, controlled her children obsessively, and lived in luxury while the empire she ruled exploited and destroyed entire populations. The Victorian era's progress came at enormous human cost. The Industrial Revolution that made Britain wealthy was built on child labor and dangerous working conditions. The empire that made Britain powerful was built on conquest, slavery, and systematic extraction of resources from colonized nations. The moral refinement Victorian society claimed was hypocrisy, sexual repression that coexisted with massive prostitution, religious piety that ignored suffering, propriety that masked cruelty. Victoria wasn't a villain in the cartoon sense. She didn't set out to cause suffering. She genuinely believed in the British Empire's civilizing mission, believed Britain was helping backward peoples by conquering and ruling them. That's what makes her scarier than a simple villain. She was a true believer, convinced of her own righteousness while presiding over atrocities. That's more dangerous than malice. Malice can be confronted. Righteousness justifies anything. Her image has been sanitized. The popular conception of Victoria is a stern but dignified queen, a woman who loved her husband and mourned him devotedly, a stable moral leader during a time of change. But the real Victoria was unstable, psychologically damaged, obsessive, racist, complicit in policies that killed millions, hiding behind mourning clothes and royal protocol, while an empire committed atrocities in her name. We name an era after her, the Victorian era, as if she embodied it. Maybe she did. Maybe the Victorian era's combination of surface, refinement and underlying brutality perfectly reflected the woman who reigned through it. A queen who wore black and spoke of morality while empire killed and exploited. Who talked about duty while neglecting it for years. Who claimed to love her children while damaging them psychologically. Who presented as the grandmother of Europe while her genetic legacy spread disease and her political legacy spread suffering. Victoria was queen for 63 years. She shaped British and world history. She's remembered as one of Britain's greatest monarchs. But greatness measured how? In territory conquered? In wealth extracted? In years on the throne? Because measured in human welfare, in justice, in actual improvement of people's lives, Victoria's reign was a disaster for millions. The Irish who starved, the Indians who died in famines, the Africans colonized and enslaved, the working-class British who labored in dangerous conditions. All of them suffered under policies Victoria supported or enabled. The statues of Victoria still stand, in London, in former colonies, reminders of empire. Some see them as symbols of British achievement. Others see them as monuments to colonialism and oppression. Both are right. Victoria's reign was both. Progress for some built on the suffering of others. That's not complicated. That's not nuanced. That's just accurate. The British Empire at its peak controlled a quarter of the world. Victoria presided over that peak, and that empire's legacy is still everywhere. In borders drawn by colonial administrators that ignore ethnic and cultural realities, in economies structured to extract resources and send them to Britain, in languages imposed on colonized peoples, in trauma that spans generations. Victoria didn't create the empire alone, but she was its symbol, its face, its longest reigning monarch during its most powerful period. She died in 1901. The Victorian era ended. The British Empire began its slow decline. World War I, which killed millions and destroyed empires, was partly caused by the alliance, systems and rivalries Victoria's family marriages created. The hemophilia she spread through royal families weakened dynasties. Her legacy is complicated, but it's not neutral. It's not just historical. It's present in inequalities and conflicts that trace back to colonial policies enacted during her reign. Queen Victoria was a person, traumatized, damaged, limited by her time's prejudices. But she was also the most powerful woman in the world for 6 decades. She had choices. She made them. And millions suffered because of those choices. That's not speculation. That's documented history. The famines, the wars, the camps, the exploitation, all happened while she reigned. All with her knowledge and often her support. The sanitized version is easier. The mourning queen, the devoted wife, the grandmother of Europe, the woman who gave her name to an age. But the real version is more important. The woman who believed in racial hierarchy, who supported empire built on violence, who controlled her children obsessively, who mourned her husband pathologically while neglecting duties, who lived in luxury while subjects starved, who spread genetic disease through European royalty, who was complicit in policies that killed millions. That's Queen Victoria, not a villain, not a hero, just a person with enormous power who used it badly, who believed things we now recognize as evil, who caused suffering she considered justified, who shaped history in ways still damaging today. The woman behind the legend, the queen behind the crown, the reality behind the sanitized version we're taught to admire. She reigned for 63 years, the Victorian era, named after her, built by her, shaped by her, and still haunting us, still shaping borders and economies and conflicts, still present in inequalities traced to colonial policies, still there in the monuments and the myths. Queen Victoria, the most globally recognized British monarch, the British Empire at its peak, and all the suffering that entailed,